I drove 500 miles to surprise my wife after 3 years overseas. But when the neighbor told me she'd already moved in with her husband last year, I laughed, until I saw the family photo through her window. The sky over Redmond was pale and gray. That washed-out kind of morning light you only get in the Pacific Northwest. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I pulled up in front of the little white house I'd been picturing every night in Afghanistan. The place looked smaller somehow. The paint a little duller. The lawn overgrown. But it was home. Or at least, it used to be. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. In the passenger seat sat a small bouquet of white lilies and a brown paper box with a tag that said, "To Claire." Inside was a bracelet I bought from a street market in Kabul. Made from polished brass. I thought she'd like it. I thought a lot of things. Actually, when I stepped out, the air was cold enough to bite my cheeks. I walked up the path, past the same rose bush I'd planted before deployment. It had withered to bare thorns. My boots made that dull crunch on the gravel as I reached the porch. I knocked twice. Smiling like a fool. No answer. I tried again. Louder this time. After a minute, the door of the neighboring house opened. A middle-aged woman stepped out, wearing a red cardigan and holding a mug. I recognized her vaguely. Linda Paris. She used to wave when I mowed the lawn. She squinted at me. "You looking for someone?" "Yeah. Claire Grant. I'm her husband. Michael. I just got back from overseas." Her mug paused halfway to her lips. Her eyebrows knit together. I could see confusion turn to discomfort. "Oh, honey. I'm not sure how to say this." I forced a laugh, trying to keep it light. "What did she sell the house?" Linda hesitated, her eyes flicking to the closed curtains of my old home. "She doesn't live here anymore. She moved out about a year ago." I blinked. "Moved out? To where?" Linda's voice softened. "She moved to Bellevue. With her husband." For a second, I thought she was joking. I actually smiled, waiting for the punchline. "My husband." "Huh, you mean me? I just got back." But Linda shook her head slowly, as if bracing for my reaction. "I see them sometimes when I drive by. Her and, well, I didn't catch his name. But they've been here a few times. Nice car. Mercedes. I think." My throat went dry. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Linda. I'm her husband. We've been married 10 years. We have a daughter. Emily. Are you sure?" She sighed, eyes full of pity. "You should probably talk to her yourself." I didn't even feel my feet moving as I walked toward the window. The blinds were half open. Through the glass, I saw the living room that used to be ours. Same couch. Same rug. Same photo frames. But the photos had changed. My hand went numb. On the mantel sat a large framed picture of Claire, Emily, and a man standing behind them with his arm around her. He was smiling. A deep, confident smile I knew too well. It was Ryan, my older brother. The air left my lungs. My knees felt weak. The bouquet slipped from my hand and fell onto the porch. I picked it up automatically. Crushed petals sticking to my fingers. My chest burned with something between disbelief and anger. But mostly, nothing. Just emptiness. Linda said something, but her voice sounded far away. I couldn't hear her over the buzzing in my head. I turned, got back into my truck, and just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. 3 years. 3 years serving my country. 3 years of counting the days to come home. Every letter I sent. Every video call that cut off halfway through. Every promise that I'd be back before Emily's 8th birthday. I believed her when she said she missed me. Now, I was staring at proof that my life had been replaced. And by my own blood, I started the engine, not sure where to go. My vision blurred. But I kept driving until the streets began to blur too. The rain started. That steady Seattle drizzle. Soft but relentless. I found a cheap motel by the docks. The kind of place that smelled like bleach and loneliness. Inside, I dropped my duffel bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the old box I'd carried since deployment. Inside were the letters Claire had written in the first year. Neat handwriting. Words like, "I'm proud of you," and "Emily keeps asking when Daddy's coming home." The last letter was dated almost 2 years ago. I hadn't noticed before. The words stopped mid-sentence. I held it under the dim yellow light, reading it again and again until the ink started to blur. My throat tightened. Somewhere outside, a ship's horn sounded across the bay. Low and distant. I took out my phone. My fingers hovered before I hit call. The line rang 3 times. No answer. Voicemail. Claire. It's me. I'm back. And Emily. Call me. Please. I ended the call and stared at the screen, waiting for it to light up. It didn't. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. I couldn't tell. I turned off the lamp and lay back, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly. My mind replayed that photo again and again. Claire's smile. Ryan's hand on her shoulder. Emily's innocent face. Somewhere between the hum of the rain and the weight of that image, I realized something I didn't want to admit. I hadn't just lost my home. I'd lost the life I thought was waiting for me. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the window. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of my daughter's laughter. But all I could hear was the echo of my brother's smile. The rain was still falling the next morning when I checked my phone again. No missed calls. No messages. The last thing on the screen was the voicemail I had left her the night before. I stared at it for a long time before slipping the phone into my jacket pocket and walking out into the gray Seattle drizzle. I didn't have a plan. Only a direction. Bellevue. The neighbor said she was there. My hands trembled as I started the truck. The roads were slick, and traffic moved like a funeral procession. I didn't even turn on the radio. Every few miles I caught myself whispering things under my breath. Maybe it's not what it looks like. Maybe Ryan was helping her. Maybe there's some reason I don't understand. But deep down, I already knew. When I reached the complex Linda mentioned, I parked across the street. The apartment building was new, modern, with glass balconies and trimmed hedges. I sat there for almost an hour, just watching. Then I saw her. Claire. She looked the same and yet completely different. Her hair shorter, her movements sharper, her smile practiced. She was holding Emily's hand, and next to her, carrying a coffee tray and talking to them as if it were the most natural thing in the world, was Ryan. They laughed at something Emily said, and he reached out to brush a strand of hair from Claire's face. She didn't pull away. My stomach tightened until I could hardly breathe. Emily turned toward the parking lot, and for a second, our eyes met through the windshield. I froze. She blinked, her face lighting up in surprise, and started to step toward the street. But Ryan crouched down, said something to her, and she stopped. Claire didn't even glance in my direction. They got into the car, and within moments, the taillights disappeared into traffic. I stayed there until my vision blurred. Then I drove aimlessly through the city until dusk. Ending up near the pier again, the smell of salt and diesel filled the cab. I parked, laid my head back, and tried to remember the sound of her voice before it all went silent. Later that night, I checked into another cheap motel, The clerk didn't look up from his screen when I handed him my ID. The room was small. A single bed, a flickering lamp, and the faint buzz of the refrigerator. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bouquet that was now wilted and brown at the edges. I thought about throwing it away but couldn't bring myself to do it. Around 9, I picked up my phone and called her again. Straight to voicemail. My voice sounded small, almost pathetic. As I said, "Claire, please call me. I just need to understand." The next morning I went to the coffee shop where Tom Keller, an old friend from the Marines, worked part-time while finishing school. The bell over the door jingled when I walked in. He looked up from behind the counter and grinned. "Mike, you son of a bitch. Look at you. You're back." I forced a smile, clapped his shoulder, and sat down. He poured me a black coffee and slid into the chair across from me. "You look like hell," he said. I told him everything, or at least the parts I could get out without choking on them. When I mentioned Ryan, his eyebrows shot up. "Ryan Grant, your brother." "Yeah, my brother." He whistled low. "Jesus, I don't know what to say." "Man, don't say anything," I muttered. "Just tell me it's not possible." He stared at the table for a long moment. "Sometimes people surprise you in the worst ways." "Mike." I wanted to punch something, but I didn't. Instead, I rubbed my temples and tried to breathe. Tom reached over, his voice lower now. "Look, you've been gone a long time. Maybe she felt alone. Maybe he took advantage of that. You don't know the whole story yet." I nodded, though I didn't believe it. I drained my coffee, paid, and walked out without saying goodbye. The air outside was cold and heavy with mist. Cars passed, horns blaring. Life moving on as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, I drove to Emily's school. I parked across the street and waited. When the bell rang, kids came pouring out with backpacks bouncing, laughter echoing. Then I saw her. My little girl. Her hair was in 2 messy braids. Her backpack too big for her shoulders. She was talking to a friend. Smiling. Carefree. For a moment I forgot everything. I stepped out of the truck and crossed the street. "Emily." I called softly. She turned, startled. And when she saw me, her eyes widened. "Daddy." My chest swelled with relief. I crouched down, holding out my arms. "Hey, sweetheart. I missed you so much." She hesitated, her small hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. "Mommy said I'm not supposed to talk to you." The words hit harder than any bullet I'd ever faced. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "It's okay. I just wanted to see you. That's all." She looked torn, glancing toward the parking lot. A silver car pulled up. Ryan stepped out, waving. Claire was in the passenger seat. Emily's eyes filled with confusion and guilt. I could see her wanting to run to me. But she didn't move. I took a step back, raising my hand in a small wave. "Be good, kiddo," she whispered. "Bye, Daddy," before hurrying to the car. I watched as Ryan opened the door for her like some kind of replacement father. Claire didn't even glance my way. The car drove off, leaving a cold emptiness behind. Back at the motel, I sat on the bed, staring at the wall until the shadows stretched long across the room. I couldn't make sense of it. I had faced firefights, roadside bombs, and nights when I didn't think I'd see another sunrise. None of it hurt like this. Eventually, I reached for the small notebook I kept during deployment. The one where I wrote letters I never sent. I opened to the first blank page and started writing. "I came home today. The house is gone. She's gone. Emily called someone else Daddy. I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. The pen trembled in my hand. I shut the notebook and let it drop to the floor. Outside. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low over the city, heavy and unmoving. I walked to the window, watching the reflection of passing cars in the puddles, somewhere across the water. My brother was probably sitting in my living room, reading my daughter a bedtime story. The thought hollowed me out. I turned off the light and lay down fully clothed. The sheets smelled like old detergent and damp air. I stared into the dark until my eyes blurred. Sleep didn't come. Only the echo of Emily's voice and the look on her face when she said she wasn't supposed to talk to me. The next morning, I packed my bag and left the motel key on the counter without a word. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay there, surrounded by ghosts of what used to be mine. The morning air in Seattle carried that damp chill that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes the whole city feel like it's still half asleep. I pulled my jacket tighter and kept walking, not really sure where my feet were taking me. I ended up at the marina, the same one I used to visit before deployments, where the smell of salt and oil always reminded me of home. Only now, it didn't feel like home at all. I called Tom. He picked up on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "Mike, you okay?" "Not really," I said. "You got time to meet?" An hour later, we were sitting in a diner off Alaskan Way, the kind of place that's been there for decades and smells like burnt coffee and bacon grease. Tom slid into the booth across from me, wearing his old leather jacket and that look of cautious concern I remembered from our days overseas. "So, talk to me. Man, what's going on?" I told him everything. The photo. The apartment. Emily calling Ryan Daddy. I tried to keep my voice steady, but by the time I finished, my hands were clenched so tight around the coffee mug that my knuckles had turned white. Tom didn't interrupt. He just stared at the table, shaking his head slowly. "You sure it's him?" he finally asked. I nodded. I'd know that face anywhere. He leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "That's messed up. Man, real messed up." I laughed once, the sound flat and bitter. "Yeah, that's one way to put it." Tom watched me for a long moment, then said, "You been sleeping at all?" "A couple hours." "Maybe. You look like hell." I shrugged. "I've seen worse," he said, rubbing his jaw. "Mike, I don't know what's going through your head right now, but don't do anything stupid. You're fresh out of service. You're wired tight. You need time to think, not act." I didn't answer. He wasn't wrong, but the anger sitting in my chest felt too heavy to just wait out. The waitress refilled our cups, and for a while, neither of us said anything. The clink of dishes and the low hum of conversation around us filled the silence. Finally, Tom leaned forward. "Look, maybe she got scared. Man, maybe being alone with Emily." She leaned on Ryan. "You know how people are. Weak. Weak." I repeated quietly, staring into my coffee. He hesitated, realizing he'd hit something raw. "You know what I mean. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying maybe she didn't plan it." I wanted to believe that. God. I wanted to. But the image of Ryan's hand on her shoulder wouldn't leave my mind. After breakfast, we walked out together. Tom clapped my shoulder. "If you need a couch for a few nights, my place is open. Just don't bottle this up." "Okay. Thanks," I said, and meant it. The following days blurred together. I wandered from one end of the city to the other, staying in cheap motels, taking odd jobs just to keep busy, anything to drown out the noise in my head. But it didn't work. Every time a car horn blared, I flinched. Every time I heard something fall, my pulse spiked. Once, a delivery truck backfired near me, and I dropped flat to the pavement before I even realized what I was doing. The stares from people on the sidewalk burned, but I couldn't move for several seconds. When I finally stood, my hands were trembling. The war hadn't left me. It had just changed shape. That night I found myself outside a small bar on the edge of town. The kind of place where no one asks questions. I sat nursing a beer until Tom showed up. He must have seen something in my voice when I called, because he didn't waste time with small talk. "You had another one, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded. "Yeah." Loud noise. "I keep thinking I'm back there." He gave me that same steady look he used to when things went south overseas. "You need to get help, Mike. There's a guy at the VA who helped me out when I got back. PTSD is real. Man, it screws with your head. Don't let it eat you alive." I let out a shaky laugh. I thought coming home was supposed to fix things. Tom's voice softened. "Sometimes home's the hardest battlefield." I didn't have an answer for that. A few days later, I drove past Emily's school again. I told myself I wasn't going to stop. But I did. The playground was empty, except for a few kids finishing up aftercare. Then I saw her, my little girl, sitting on a bench, swinging her legs, staring at something in her hands. I walked closer, slow enough not to startle her. She looked up and froze when she saw me. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. She glanced toward the parking lot like she was afraid someone might see us. "Daddy, you can't be here." I smiled sadly. "I know. I just wanted to see how you're doing." She hesitated, then pulled something from her backpack. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. Mommy, Ryan, and Emily written above each one. I wasn't there. I forced my voice steady. "That's a nice picture." She looked guilty, her eyes starting to tear up. "Mommy said you're busy." I crouched down in front of her. "Tell Mommy I'll always make time for you." "Okay." Before she could answer, a car horn honked. A familiar silver Mercedes pulled up. Claire stepped out, calling her name. Emily grabbed her bag and ran off. She didn't look back. Claire's eyes met mine for a brief second across the playground. Cold, guarded. She turned away without a word, guiding Emily into the car. I stood there long after they left, the sound of the engine fading into the drizzle. That night, back at Tom's place, I couldn't sleep. The images looped in my mind like a film I couldn't stop. Claire's face, Ryan's hand, Emily's drawing. It all blurred together until it felt like I was outside my own life, watching it crumble. Tom found me sitting on the couch at dawn, staring out the window. "You gotta stop torturing yourself," he said quietly. "I know," I muttered. He set a mug of coffee in front of me. "Then, do something about it. Find out what's really going on. You're a Marine. You don't sit back and let someone else write your story." I looked at him, the first flicker of resolve cutting through the fog. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start acting. As the sun started to rise over the Seattle skyline, I picked up my keys. The city below was waking up, the same way I finally was. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew one thing. I was done being a ghost in my own life. I drove to Capitol Hill and parked a block from a small place where Claire used to like the lemon pie. The morning traffic hummed around me as I sat in the cab and tried to slow my breathing. I sent a short text that said, "We need to talk." For a minute I stared at the screen like it might blink back to life and fix everything. Then the reply came in. 30 minutes. The diner on Pine. I walked the block, with my hands jammed in my jacket pockets. counting the cracks in the sidewalk to keep my mind from sprinting ahead. Inside the diner, the air smelled like butter and coffee. A waiter nodded me toward a booth by the window. I could see people dragging umbrellas down the street. Their shoulders hunched against a mist that never quite turned to rain. Claire arrived on time. She slid into the booth across from me, without taking off her coat. She looked put together in a way that felt like armor. Her hair was shorter now, sharp around the jaw. I noticed the absence on her left hand and felt a small snap inside my chest. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. She folded her hands and kept her eyes on the salt shaker. She said we should make this quick. I tried to start somewhere human. I said I saw Emily at school. I said she looked good. I said I missed her. Claire lifted her chin. She said you cannot show up like that. She said it confuses her. I swallowed the first words that rose up. I told her I had been gone 3 years. I told her I came home to a stranger in my place. I asked her when it started. Her eyes flicked to mine and then away. She said she did not want to go through the details. She said it would only make things worse. She said she had been alone. She said Ryan listened. She said things changed. I stared at the sugar packet in my fingers until it crumpled. I asked if she understood what she had done. I asked if she understood who he is to me. She said she knew. She said none of this was simple. She said people fall apart in slow motion and do not notice until it is too late. She said she was sorry for the hurt, but not for saving herself. The waiter came by and we both said we were fine. He retreated like a man who knew better than to intervene in a quiet disaster. I told her I was not the one who left. I told her I went because it was my duty. I told her I counted days on a wall. I told her I kept a photo of the 3 of us in my pocket until the edges wore white. I told her I believed her when she said she would wait. Claire's mouth trembled and then said again. She said she did wait. She said the waiting changed her. She said this is not a courtroom. She said we need to talk about what comes next. She reached into her bag and slid a manila envelope toward me. I did not touch it. She said it was a proposal. She said she would keep primary custody. She said I would have visitation. She said there would be a financial settlement to help me get started. She said it was fair. I stared at the envelope. The room felt too warm. I could hear the hiss of the kitchen and the scrape of a fork on ceramic. I asked who wrote this. I asked if Ryan had a hand in it. Her silence answered for her. I said the number out loud. 200,000. It sounded like a price tag. I looked at her left hand again and the skin where the ring had been. I said you cannot buy my silence. I said you cannot buy back trust. I said I would not sell my place in my daughter's life. She drew a breath and let it out slowly. She said no one was buying anything. She said this was about stability for Emily. She said my life was not stable right now. I almost laughed. I said of course it is not stable. I just came home to find my world boarded up. I asked her how long. She did not answer. I asked again. She said almost 2 years. The number hung between us like frost. The windows fogged at the edges. I wiped my palms on my jeans. I told her I wanted to see Emily regularly. I told her I would not agree to anything that treated me like a stranger. I said I would get a lawyer. She nodded, as if she had expected that. She said that was my right. She said she had already spoken to one. She said there was no need to make this ugly. My throat tightened. I said it was already ugly. We sat in silence while the waiter refilled our waters. Outside, a bus wheezed to a stop and people shuffled on with their bags and tired faces. I thought about the sleepers I had watched board helicopters in the dark, and how some of them did not come back, and how the ones who did came back, hollowed out in ways you cannot explain to someone who has never stared into that kind of night. Claire stood. She said she would email me dates for visitation. She said she hoped I would be reasonable. She put on her coat. She stepped away without touching me. I did not open the envelope. I took it with me anyway. Driving south, I realized I was 10 minutes from my parents' house in West Seattle. My hands moved before my head caught up. I pulled into the driveway I had ridden a bike down when my feet barely reached the pedals. The porch light was on even though it was noon. My mother opened the door before I knocked. The way mothers can sense their sons on the other side. Her face brightened and then crumpled when she saw mine. "Michael," she said in that soft voice that always made me 8 years old again. She reached for me, and I let her hold me for a second longer than I meant to. Then she stepped back and smoothed my jacket like she could fix the creases time had put there. My father was at the dining table with papers spread in neat stacks. He did not stand. He nodded at the chair across from him. I sat and placed the envelope on the table between us. I told them I had met with Claire. I told them about Emily. I told them about Ryan. My mother covered her mouth. My father's jaw tightened and then relaxed. The way it does when he is choosing words like chess pieces. He asked if I was sure. I looked at him. He looked down. He said Ryan had been helping Claire with the company. He said medicine tech had hit a rough patch during the second year. He said capital is complicated. He said none of this is about you. I felt heat rise in my face. I said it is exactly about me. I said he is my brother. I said he knew what it would do. My father said life does not freeze for service. His tone was a courtroom tone. Cool and tidy. He said you left, and she adapted. He said it is not pretty, but it is common. He said I needed to be pragmatic. He said accept the arrangement and move on. My mother reached across and took my hand. Her fingers trembled. She told my father to stop. She said that is enough. She told me she was sorry. She asked if I was eating. She asked if I had a place to stay. I said I was staying at Tom's. I said I was fine. My father glanced at the envelope again. He asked what the offer was. I told him. He nodded once. A small approval that felt like a slap. He said that was more than fair given the circumstances. Given the circumstances, the words tasted like metal. I stood too fast and the chair legs scraped the floor. My mother flinched. I told them I did not come for advice. I told them I came for family. My father looked at me, and I saw calculation there. The same look he wore when a witness said something he had been waiting to hear. He said family is not a shield against consequences. I said I fought for this family. I said I bled for the picture on that mantle. I said my brother took it and you are telling me to sign for delivery. He did not answer. He looked back down at his papers, like a judge returning to the docket. I kissed my mother's cheek and left before the room could shrink any smaller. On the porch, I stood looking at the maple in the front yard. I remembered climbing it as a kid. The bark rough against my palms. The thrill of being just high enough to see over the fence. The wind moved through the leaves with a sound like distant water. Back in the truck, I put the envelope on the passenger seat beside the cobble bracelet and the stack of letters. I stared at the 3 items like they were a map I did not know how to read. Then I started the engine and drove toward downtown without deciding to. I parked near the glass tower where Medicine Tech had its offices. The building rose clean and blue against the wet gray sky. People streamed in and out with badges clipped to their belts. I sat with the engine off and watched the revolving door swirl strangers into the lobby. A patrol car rolled past, and my stomach tightened before my head could tell it to settle. I took a breath and focused on the building's reflection in a puddle. I thought about walking in. About asking for Ryan at the front desk. About what I would do if he came down in one of those tailored jackets, and the smile that used to get us both out of trouble when we were kids. I did not walk in. Not yet. The anger in me had sharpened, but it had also cooled. I needed more than rage. I needed the truth. I needed proof that could not be argued into dust on a dining table. My phone buzzed. A text from Tom. He asked where I was. He said he had been thinking. He said there might be a way to find out what Ryan was really doing with Claire and her company. He said meet me at the pier after sunset. I looked up at the glass tower one more time. Then started the truck. The wipers swiped the mist from the windshield in a steady rhythm. For the first time since I had come home, the path in front of me did not look like a dead end. It looked like a narrow road through dark woods. I did not know where it led, but I knew I was finally facing the right direction. The wind off Elliott Bay carried that sharp smell of salt and metal when I pulled into the parking lot near the pier. The sun was low, a pale streak of orange over the water, and the air felt colder than it should for spring. Tom was already there, leaning against his car, 2 coffees in hand, his breath fogging slightly as he watched the waves slap against the pilings. He handed me a cup as I walked up. Black. No sugar. Just like before, he said. I nodded, took a sip, and waited. Tom stared out at the water for a while before speaking. I did some digging, he said. A friend of mine from the Corps works IT at Medicine Tech. He told me something about Ryan's setup there smells bad. My pulse quickened. What kind of bad? Tom looked over his shoulder, lowering his voice even though we were alone. Ryan doesn't actually work for the company. He's listed as an external consultant through a shell investment group called Norvale Partners. That group only exists on paper. No website. No office. No tax filings. But it's been receiving regular wire transfers from Medicine Tech's corporate account. Big ones. I stared at him, the sound of the bay fading behind the thrum in my ears. You're sure? Tom nodded. I saw the internal ledger. The payments are coded as strategic investment advisory fees. But every month, the amounts increase, and the authorizations come directly from Claire's digital signature. The realization hit hard. Claire's name was being used to funnel money to Ryan. Either she was helping him or she was being played. Tom continued. My buddy says the company's board has been asking questions. He thinks there's a full audit coming soon. If Ryan's behind it, it's going to blow up. I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but focus. For months, my mind had been fogged with anger and confusion. Now there was something solid, something I could aim at. Can your guy get copies of the transactions? I asked. He said he could, but it would take a few days. I nodded and looked out at the water. The ferries were moving slow, lights flickering across the waves. I asked Tom not to tell anyone else yet. On the drive back, the city lights blurred in the mist. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I replayed the conversation. If Ryan was stealing from her company, everything he had built with her would eventually crumble. I didn't know if I wanted justice or revenge anymore. Maybe both. 2 days later, Tom called. He sounded nervous. You better come see this in person. We met again. This time in his apartment. He had his laptop open on the kitchen table, the glow from the screen reflecting off a half-empty bottle of beer. The folder was labeled Medicine Internal. Inside were PDFs, wire confirmations, and transaction histories showing hundreds of thousands of dollars routed from Medicine Tech's main account to Norvale Partners over 6 months. But what froze me was the destination. Offshore accounts. Cayman Islands. Tom scrolled through the files. Look at this pattern. Every transfer happens the same day Ryan flies out on business. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. It was all there. Dates. Amounts. Names. Proof. Tom leaned back, rubbing his face. What are you going to do with it? I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to take it straight to the police. Another part wanted to walk into Ryan's office and slam the evidence on his desk, just to watch his smug face fall apart. But I knew better. He was too slick, too careful. If I moved too early, he'd bury it. I asked Tom to email me copies of everything. Then I drove to the waterfront and sat in the truck, scrolling through the documents on my phone. The numbers didn't lie. Ryan had turned Medicine Tech into his personal ATM. That night, I barely slept. My head spun with possibilities. Claire had built that company from the ground up, pouring every hour and dollar she had into it. If Ryan was using her to cover his tracks, then she was more than just unfaithful. She was his mark. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I called Claire's office and left a message asking her to meet me. She didn't respond. I called again that afternoon. Same result. Finally, I sent a message saying I had information about Ryan that could ruin her if she ignored it. 10 minutes later, her assistant called back. She said Claire could meet me at a cafe near the office after hours. When she walked in, she looked exhausted. The sharpness was gone from her eyes, replaced by something brittle. She didn't sit until I slid the phone across the table. Screen lit with one of the wire transfers. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low. "That's your signature on the authorization." I said, "Those funds went to Norvale Partners. That's Ryan's company." She frowned, shaking her head. "That's impossible. I never approved those transfers." I watched her closely. "You sure about that? Because the paper trail says otherwise." She scrolled through the documents, her hands trembling. "He said those were internal consultancy fees. He said they were legal. He lied. Claire, he's been laundering money through your name." Her face drained of color. I could almost see the gears turning as she realized what it meant. Fraud. Embezzlement. Jail. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I want you to help me stop him. I want you to expose him before he drags you down with him." She hesitated. "You think I can just walk into the boardroom and accuse him, without proof?" "You have proof," I said, pointing to the phone. "And you have motive." She looked up at me, eyes wet. "You think this makes us even?" "No," I said quietly. "It's not about even. It's about truth." She didn't answer, just stared out the window. After a long silence, she said she'd think about it. I could tell she meant it, but fear was still in control. As she left, I caught sight of a dark sedan idling across the street. A man sat behind the wheel, face hidden by the reflection of passing lights. For a second, I thought it might be Ryan. Then the car rolled away, disappearing into traffic. I drove back to Tom's place that night, every instinct in me buzzing like an alarm. He opened the door before I knocked. "You look like hell," he said. He wasn't wrong. I told him everything that happened at the cafe. He exhaled slowly. "Mike, if Ryan realizes you're involved, he's not going to just sit back. Guys like him, they don't get scared. They get dangerous." I stared at the rain streaking down the window. Maybe he should be scared this time. Tom looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "Just don't do something you can't come back from." I didn't respond. The line between justice and revenge had already started to blur, and I wasn't sure which side I was standing on anymore. Outside, the storm broke open, lightning flashing over the bay. It felt like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The storm lasted all night. I barely slept, pacing the narrow space between the couch and the window, watching the lightning strike over the bay like camera flashes from a world that didn't care about mine. Around 3 a.m, I sat down and wrote everything out by hand. The dates, the wire transfers, the conversations with Tom, and the meeting with Claire. I needed it on paper. Something that couldn't be hacked or deleted. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. Claire might still be trapped between guilt and fear. But I wasn't. I had enough proof to start something. The question was where. Tom was half asleep when I shook his shoulder. He grunted and squinted at the clock. "It's 6. "Mike." I told him I was going to see someone at the Seattle Police Department. I said I needed a detective who worked white-collar crimes. He sat up, rubbing his face. You sure about this? You hand that stuff over? It's out of your control. I nodded. Maybe that's what it needs to be. Tom threw on a sweatshirt and came with me. The city was quiet. The streets still slick from the rain. We parked near the precinct and walked inside. The desk sergeant looked us over. Bored. Until I told him I had evidence of corporate fraud involving a major biotech firm. That woke him up fast. 10 minutes later, we were sitting in a small office that smelled like coffee and printer ink. A woman in her early 40s entered. Sharp eyes. Hair pulled tight. Detective Laura Bennett. She introduced herself and asked us to start from the beginning. I laid out everything. The affair. The shell company. The wire transfers. The offshore accounts. I slid the printed documents across the desk and waited as she skimmed through them, flipping pages with a faint rustle. When she finally looked up, she said the words I'd been waiting for. This looks real. She asked how I got the files. I told her the truth. Tom's friend at Medicine Tech had access to internal data and suspected fraud. She nodded slowly, jotting notes. I can't use this officially unless your contact is willing to come forward. But it's a start. She leaned back, thoughtful. Norvale Partners. That name has come up before. Tom glanced at me. You've seen it in other cases. She nodded again. A few small investigations down in California and Nevada. Nothing that stuck. Always dissolved before charges could land. Same pattern. Investors disappear. Companies lose money. And the records trace back to dead corporations in the Caymans. Ryan's fingerprints were all over it. Detective Bennett said she would file an internal inquiry and loop in the Financial Crimes Unit. She warned me to stay out of it now. Not to confront anyone directly. If Ryan caught wind of a police investigation, he'd vanish before they could freeze the accounts. Tom thanked her, and we left. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. We grabbed breakfast at a diner near the station. Tom ordered pancakes and didn't eat them. He stared at his coffee and finally said, "You did the right thing." I wasn't sure I believed him. Over the next week, I tried to live normally. I helped Tom with some work around his place. Called my mother. Even jogged a few mornings by the waterfront. But under everything, there was this constant hum. Like a wire ready to snap. Then, 3 days later, Detective Bennett called. She asked if I could come in. Her tone was careful. Controlled. When I arrived, she had a file open on her desk and an expression that made my stomach twist. She said Ryan had been tipped off. Someone inside Medicine Tech had warned him about the inquiry. He'd cleared his office and left town the day before the warrant request came through. I clenched my fists. You think it was Claire? Bennett hesitated. She said she didn't know. But Claire had resigned that morning and emptied her personal accounts. My head spun. I felt the air leave my lungs. Where would she go? Bennett closed the file. We're working on it. If she was involved, she might be trying to cover herself. If not, she might be scared for her life. The thought of Ryan alone with her made my stomach knot tighter. I asked if they'd put out a trace on his car or his credit cards. They had. But he was smart. He hadn't used anything traceable in 48 hours. When I left the station, the afternoon light hit like a glare. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. It said, "Stop digging or you'll lose more than money." I froze. Tom was at work. And no one else knew what I'd given the detective. The message deleted itself before I could screenshot it. That night, I stayed awake with every light on. The documents spread across the table again. I kept checking the window like a fool, Around midnight, someone knocked on the door. My pulse jumped. I reached for the small Glock I kept in my bag since the war. Tom's voice came through the door. "It's me. Man. Don't shoot." I exhaled hard and opened it. He looked rattled, his shirt damp from the rain. "I just got a call from my friend at medicine. He said someone broke into the office last night. Server rooms wiped. Security footage gone. Whoever did it knew exactly what to take." I sat down, rubbing my temples. Ryan was cleaning house. Tom said quietly, "He's going to come for you next." I looked up at him, the weight of everything settling in. He's already started. The next morning, I called Claire. The line went straight to voicemail. I left a message telling her the police were involved, that she needed to stay somewhere safe. I didn't expect a response. That evening, I finally got one. A single text. It said, "Meet me where it started. 7 o'clock. Don't bring anyone." I stared at the words, feeling the blood drain from my face. Where it started meant the marina, the place where she used to wait for me before I shipped out. Tom told me it sounded like a trap. I told him it didn't matter. If Claire was in danger, I had to go. At dusk, I parked near the docks. The water was calm, a mirror of dark glass reflecting the faint city lights. I walked down the wooden planks until I reached the old pier where the paint had peeled and the railing was loose. Claire was there. Her hair was pulled back, her face pale under the orange glow of the streetlight. She looked smaller than I remembered, like life had taken pieces of her. "Mike," she said softly. "Thank God you came." I asked her where Ryan was. She said she didn't know, that he had turned on her the second she confronted him with the documents I'd shown her. He'd taken everything, drained her accounts, vanished. She said she'd been hiding for 2 days, afraid to go home, afraid he'd find her. She begged me to help her talk to the police again, to make things right. Before I could answer, I heard a sound behind us. Tires on gravel. A black SUV rolling slow down the narrow road toward the dock. Claire's face went white. "That's his car." I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my throat. The SUV stopped, headlights glaring through the mist. A figure stepped out. Tall, familiar, silhouette sharp against the light. "Ryan." He called my name. Voice smooth and calm. The same voice he used when we were kids and he was about to cheat me out of something. "Mike. Let's talk like family." The pistol was cold in my pocket. The night air colder still. Claire's hand trembled beside me. The water lapped quietly against the pier. For a moment, none of us moved. The city was silent except for the faint hum of an engine and the sound of my own heartbeat. And then Ryan took a step forward. The beam of the headlights cut through the mist, turning the pier into a strip of white and shadow. Ryan stopped a few feet from us, hands raised slightly like a man trying to calm a wild animal. His voice stayed smooth, practiced, the kind that once convinced investors to hand him millions. "We don't have to do this out here. Mike, let's go somewhere and talk." Claire's grip tightened on my arm. I could feel her shaking. I told her to get behind me, but she didn't move. Ryan smiled faintly when he saw the movement. Still playing the protector. Huh. Always thought that was cute. I felt the anger rise like heat from the pavement. "You stole from her company." I said. "You used her. You used my family." Ryan tilted his head. "Used is a strong word." She knew what she was signing. "You think you're the only one who ever sacrificed something for family. You call this sacrifice," I said. "You ruin everything you touch." He took a slow step closer. The headlights behind him threw his shadow long across the pier. "Don't act like you're clean." Mike, you left. You ran halfway across the world to play soldier while the real work happened here. You think you're some hero because you followed orders. The world moved on without you. I heard Claire whisper my name. But I couldn't take my eyes off him. My fingers brushed the grip of the Glock in my pocket. Slick from the sweat on my palms. He saw it. His smirk widened. You going to shoot me? Little brother, that what it's come to. You should walk away right now. I said quietly. He laughed once. Sharp and humorless. You think you can scare me? I've been 2 steps ahead of you since we were kids. You always wanted fairness. Justice. Truth. Those are toys for men who don't know how to win. I took a step forward, closing the space between us until I could see the strain at the corners of his mouth. You're done winning. He moved fast. Faster than I expected. His hand went for his jacket. And I saw the glint of metal. I drew before I could think. The sound cracked across the pier, echoing over the water. Ryan froze. The pistol half drawn. My bullet had hit the ground near his feet, splintering wood and sending a shard into the air. Claire screamed, clutching her ears. Ryan stopped moving, breathing hard. You missed, he said softly. No, I said. I warned you. He looked at me for a long second, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he lowered the gun slowly and kicked it toward the edge of the pier. It slid and dropped into the water with a soft splash. You think you've got the moral high ground now, he said. You don't know what's coming. You don't even understand the game you stepped into. What game? I demanded. He smiled again. Smaller this time. Norvale isn't mine alone. You burn me. You burn her. And you burn half the people keeping this city's money moving. You really think a detective and a few bank records can fix that? The headlights cut off behind him. And for a moment everything was dark, except the thin orange glow from the streetlight above. Then another car door slammed. 2 silhouettes emerged. Heavy and quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes with practice. Ryan's voice dropped low. These men aren't here for me. You shouldn't have gone to the cops. Mike. They don't like attention. I felt the back of my neck prickle. Claire grabbed my sleeve, pulling me backward. One of the men started walking down the pier, his coat hanging open just enough for me to see the handle of a gun. Ryan raised his hands like he was part of the audience. Sorry, brother. I tried to tell you. That was when everything went sideways. The first man reached for his weapon, and I fired before he could draw. The shot tore through the mist, sending him stumbling back with a yell. The second man ducked behind the SUV and returned fire. The muzzle flash lit up the night, deafening in the tight space. Claire screamed again, hitting the deck. Ryan dove behind a piling. I dropped to one knee and fired again, shattering a headlight. The pier filled with smoke and splintered wood. Then I heard the second man's gun click empty. The silence afterward was heavier than the gunfire. When I stood, Ryan was gone. His SUV was still there. Engine running. Door open. Claire was crying quietly, hands over her face. I scanned the shadows and caught movement at the far end of the pier. A figure limping toward the road. I grabbed Claire's hand. Come on. We have to go. We ran to Tom's truck, parked up the street. I peeled away from the dock as sirens started in the distance. Claire sobbed into her hands, and I could feel my own pulse thundering through the steering wheel. What just happened back there? She gasped. I think Ryan set me up. Or maybe he thought they'd scare me off. Either way, someone wanted us both quiet. She looked at me, eyes wide and wet. He said Norvale wasn't just him. What does that mean? I didn't know. But the pieces were falling fast. Offshore accounts, shell companies. And now, muscle on the docks. This wasn't just a scam. It was a network. I drove straight to Tom's place. When he saw our faces, he didn't ask questions. He locked the door, pulled the blinds, and fetched a first aid kit for the small cut on Claire's arm from flying debris. "You need to go to the cops right now," he said. "Tell them everything. They'll think I fired first." I said, "2 men dead. 1 gone. No witness, but Claire. Then we need proof." Tom said, "Real proof. Something that ties Ryan to all of it." Claire lifted her head. "His laptop. He keeps everything backed up on a private cloud. But his physical laptop has a key file, encrypted with his password. If we can get it, the police can decrypt the rest." Where I asked, she hesitated. "He keeps a place downtown. A penthouse at the Harbor Light. He uses it for meetings. There's a safe in the office." Tom looked at me. "You realize if he's running, that place might already be watched." I nodded. I also realized it was the only chance we had left. By midnight, we were parked 3 blocks from the Harbor Light Tower, a glass and steel monument that looked out over the city like it owned the view. The streets were slick and mostly empty. A security guard smoked near the loading dock, not looking up as we slipped in through a side entrance Claire knew from before. We took the elevator to the top floor. The doors opened to a quiet hallway lined with marble and art that probably cost more than my truck. The office door was locked, but Claire still remembered the key code. When it clicked open, the sound was louder than thunder in my ears. Inside, the place smelled faintly of cologne and coffee. Everything was neat, deliberate. The city lights poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the glass desk into a mirror. There, beside a bottle of scotch, was Ryan's laptop. I told Claire to stay by the door while I crossed the room. The screen was dark but warm. He'd used it recently. I slid it into my bag. Then I looked around and spotted a small safe built into the cabinet behind the desk. "Can you open it?" I asked. Claire nodded, knelt down, and started turning the dial. Her fingers shook, but she moved quickly. After a few tense seconds, there was a soft click. She pulled it open. Inside were stacks of documents, several passports, and a hard drive in a silver case. I grabbed the drive and stuffed it into my pocket. That was when I heard the elevator ding. Tom's head snapped up. "Someone's coming." We killed the lights. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. I pressed against the wall, gun raised. A shadow passed under the door. And then the knob turned slowly. The door creaked open, and the silhouette stepped inside. For a second, I thought it was Ryan again. Then the light from the hallway hit his face, and I saw the glint of a badge on his belt. Detective Bennett froze when she saw me. Her hand hovered near her gun. She whispered, "What the hell are you doing here?" I lowered my weapon. "We found something," I said. "Ryan's laptop. His files." Her eyes flicked to Claire, then back to me. "You need to leave. Right now. This building's under surveillance. If they see you here, I can't protect you." Behind her, another elevator chimed. More footsteps, heavier ones. Bennett's expression hardened. "Go. Out the back. Don't stop." Tom didn't need to be told twice. We slipped out the emergency stairwell as voices filled the hall behind us. By the time we reached the alley, the night had turned cold again. I could still hear the hum of the city above, the sound of sirens somewhere far away. Claire leaned against the wall, breathing hard, eyes on the laptop bag. "We got it," she whispered. "Yeah," I said, staring down the dark street. But now the clock's ticking. We moved fast and quiet through the alley, until the street opened up and the city swallowed us again. Tom drove. Claire kept her hands on the laptop like it might jump out of the bag. And I watched the rearview mirror until my neck ached. We cut across downtown and stopped 2 blocks from the precinct. I told Tom to circle while I walked the last stretch alone with the bag. It felt like handing off a live wire. Detective Bennett met me in the same small office with the humming printer and the worn chairs. Her eyes were sharp, but something in her face had softened since the night at the harbor light. She closed the blinds, locked the door, and set the laptop on her desk. I gave her the silver drive from my pocket. She powered up a forensics unit, connected both devices, and started an imaging process that looked like a tide of numbers rolling across the screen. She said, "This will take a while." She said I should not be here when anyone else comes in. She asked if Claire would cooperate. I told her Claire was ready to talk. She nodded once. The kind of nod that means gears are finally catching. Tom texted that he had Claire parked around the corner. Bennett stepped out to bring her in through a side entrance, so the front desk log would not tip anyone off. I stood by the window with my hands in my pockets and watched a gull ride the air outside like it was nothing. The city kept moving. Cabs, buses, a kid on a scooter. Somewhere in it, my brother believed himself untouchable. By late afternoon, Bennett came back with 2 agents from financial crimes. Their jackets carried the weight of a dozen tired cases. They took statements. They photographed the devices. They logged the chain of custody. Claire spoke with a voice that shook and then steadied as she walked through her part. The signatures. The meetings. The times Ryan told her to sign and not ask questions. I watched her face while she talked, and for the first time since I came home, I saw fear give way to responsibility. Not pity. Not forgiveness. Just a clear choice to stop lying to herself. When we left the station, the light was already going gold. Bennett walked us to the side door. She said they would move quickly now. She said there would be subpoenas and warrants and calls to federal partners. She told me to stay available and out of the way. Then she thanked me. Not grand. Not theatrical. Just a simple thank you that landed somewhere steady in my chest. The next 3 days stretched like wire. I slept a few hours at a time. Ate when Tom pushed plates at me, and kept my phone on the table with the volume turned high. On the morning of the 4th day, it rang before sunrise. Bennett said to turn on the news. Aerial footage showed a strip mall in El Paso, with 4 patrol cars and a pair of unmarked SUVs. A black sedan sat in the middle of the lot with both doors open. The ticker at the bottom of the screen ran Ryan's name, along with several counts of fraud and money laundering. A reporter used words like coordinated warrants and interstate task force. I stood in Tom's kitchen with the coffee going cold in my hand and watched my brother get led across the lot in cuffs. He kept his chin up and his smile set like a mask. He had always loved an audience. The news cycle chewed for days. Mark Dempsey at the Seattle Ledger ran a long piece with timelines and documents and quotes from former investors. Norvale Partners went from whispers in private rooms to a front-page cautionary tale. The board at Medicine Tech put out a statement and held a vote. Claire was suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the investigation. She moved out of the Bellevue apartment and into a studio across the lake. She called to tell me she had done it. The call was short. There were long silences where the word sorry tried to crawl out and failed. My parents took the blow like people who had walked barefoot across ice and finally fallen through. My mother called me crying in a way I had not heard since I was a boy. My father did not call. A week later, he showed up at Tom's and stood on the sidewalk with his hat in his hands. He said he was wrong. He said the phrase given the circumstances like it hurt his teeth. I told him to come inside and sit. We did not fix decades in an afternoon. But we started with coffee and the quiet understanding that pride had cost us all too much. Time did a strange thing then. It stopped racing. It settled into days that had shape again. I found a small storefront a few blocks off First Avenue. A corner with good foot traffic and a west-facing window. With a little savings and a little help from a veteran's grant, I signed a lease and sanded wood until my hands found their old strength. I painted the walls a color that looked like morning. I bought a used roaster and learned the rhythm of beans cracking like distant fire. I hung a simple sign that said Redwood Roastery, because the name felt like something that had been here longer than me. On the soft opening day, Tom leaned on the counter and told me I looked 10 years younger. A few regulars from the neighborhood came in and pretended not to notice the new guy shaking milk like it was a science experiment. In the afternoons, Emily sat at a small table by the window and did her homework while I worked the bar. We started with supervised visits at a park and then at the shop with a social worker at the next table. It felt strange at first, the way life does when it is learning a new step. But by the third week she was telling me about a school project on planets. And by the fifth she had taped a crayon drawing to the wall behind the register. It had 3 stick figures holding hands under a blue sky, and my name was written above one of them in letters that leaned like small trees. One evening near closing, Claire walked in. She looked like someone who had been standing in the wind for a long time. She asked if we could talk. I wiped my hands and nodded. We sat at a corner table and watched the last light slip down the street. She said she had met with prosecutors and told them everything. She said she had moved out quietly so Emily would not have to watch her life collapse in a single day. She said the board had called and there might be civil action. She said she knew she could not ask for a clean slate. Then she asked anyway. She asked if there was any chance we could find our way back. I listened. I let the words settle. I thought about the night on the pier, the envelope on the dining table, the photo on the mantel, the way 3 years had stretched us into people neither of us recognized. I told her I was done being angry. I told her I wanted peace for our daughter. I told her forgiveness was not a door that led back to the old house. It was a path away from it. She nodded with tears in her eyes and said that was fair. She touched the edge of the table like it might keep her from floating away. Then she stood and left quietly into the evening. Months turned into a year. Ryan took a plea when the evidence stacked higher than the stories he could invent. The court called it a complex scheme. I called it the long shadow of a man who had never learned where the line was. The judge read out a sentence that would keep him in a federal facility until the gray in his hair matched the concrete. I did not go to the hearing. I sat in my shop and ground beans and watched the sun slide through the window onto the floor like honey. I do not know when I started sleeping through the night again. It just happened. One morning I woke and realized I had not listened for footsteps or engines for hours. I realized the silence was just silence. Tom came by most mornings and tested the espresso like a drill instructor. Detective Bennett stopped in twice, ordered black coffee, and left a tip that made me blush. My father appeared on Sundays, took his time with a pastry, and told me stories about cases he had tried back when the world made sense to him. My mother taught Emily to bake cinnamon rolls that made the whole shop smell like Christmas in the middle of May. On the anniversary of the opening, I stood at the window with the lights off and watched the city breathe. The last customers had drifted out, and the quiet was full without being empty. Emily played a simple melody on a small keyboard in the corner, the notes thin and pure. I wiped down the counter and listened to the music settle in my chest like a promise I finally believed. I drove 500 miles to surprise my wife, and found out the life I was racing toward had ended months before. I thought that was the cruelest sentence a man could live. It was not. The cruelest sentence is living in the past after it has already let you go. The mercy is learning to step out of it. The mercy is a clean morning, and your child laughing at a joke you did not see coming. The mercy is a fresh pot of coffee and a door that opens and closes with people who call you by your name. If you walked with me to the end of this story, tell me what you would have done at that pier. Tell me the moment that hit you hardest and why. Drop your thoughts, your own stories, the lessons you learned the hard way. If this kind of story speaks to you, stick around. There are more roads to walk. more mornings to earn. And I would be glad to have you here for the next one.